welcome you all to Trek Wars.
So today we're going to talk about the history of Captain Micah and the situations that he was with the Orion pirates. So before he became the captain of the USS Rattlesnake, he was actually a well-distinguished captain who was picked by Admiral Kirk himself in order to take command of one of these new generation starships because of his interesting tactics dealing with the Orions. Now, to get to understand what was going on, there were three sectors that were protected by one destroyer under Captain Micah, and this was the USS Rattlesnake. Now, this is a Federation destroyer. This is a new generation destroyer. So it had two photon torpedoes, and it had 7 dual Type 7 phaser emitters. So the ship was considered lightly armed. So we'll look a little bit more at the USS Rattlesnake, and we'll look at its full complement to get a full understanding of what we're dealing with. Alright, so this is a new generation destroyer. It's considered lightly armed by the time period, but it does have a pretty decent sized crew. So obviously it has 7 dual phaser emitters, and they're going to be Type 7. It's going to have standard photon torpedoes. Now, the ship model type is an NCC-520 frame. And then obviously the ship type is destroyer. It has a crew of 300. So there are 35 officers, 265 crew, and there can be up to 30 Marines at any one time on this ship. So though the ship is pretty small for a ship of its era, it's still decent enough and large enough that it can be considered a destroyer, and it's out there and it's defending other sectors. So let's talk about the Genghis class. So the Genghis class is probably the lightest class of Federation New Generation starship. It's a 1 nacelle starship. So with it being a 1 nacelle starship, we know that it's designed for not deep space exploration, but for local defense. Now, this ship is using one of the new state-of-the-art warp cores, which are seen with the Constitution Rift. And the design specifications are identical to the USS Enterprise Rift. So the US Enterprise Rift is a heavy cruiser, which is a Constitution-class starship. This ship is similar in design specifications, but it lacks some of the abilities, and we'll talk about that now. So if you guys are familiar, 390,000 is a standard 1.0 shielding, which is seen on the Constitution class starships. So those heavy cruisers have a shield matrix of 1.0, which is 390,000. So the destroyer has a shield index of 1.25. So that means its shields are actually stronger, and they're at 487,500. Now, this is what's most important about ships like this, the refreshment rate. So that means how fast the shields can actually regenerate themselves is at 1.58. So at 1.58, it's a pretty pathetic shield generation. And that's because of the size of the ship and the warp core that it's using. It's a newer generation core, but it's still pretty small. So for an example, if you look at newer generation starships like a heavy destroyer, the refreshment rate is 8.95. Let's look at a ship that people do know, the heavy cruiser. So just about everybody knows the original Captain Kirk ship, and then you know it's a Constitution class ship, and you know that there was a evolved version that had a new warp core, which we refer to as the Enterprise Rift. Now this Rift generation starships are what we're talking about. So let's look at the Constitution Rift heavy command ship, and we'll open it up right now. Okay, so a heavy cruiser, as you can see, it's 1, refreshment rate is 9.21, and its shields are 390, which we've all talked about. So why you can generate more power to these shields But there's a secondary feature, which is the shield refreshment rate. But the reason why ships like the destroyer don't have good refreshment rates is really simple. Those large batteries, there's no room for them. So they don't have the ability to regenerate their shields quickly like some of these heavy cruisers. So, to give you an idea, it's almost as if the shield regeneration, think about it as a point scale. So imagine if it was a 50 points or 100 points. You get 50 additional points of shield regeneration for the destroyer. Now, you do 50 times 9.21, and that's how much shield regeneration you're getting for the heavy cruisers. So their shielding, though it's the same energy, it's pretty similar. In reality, it's 9 times better. So the shielding is regenerating itself at a rate of 9, which is so much better than 1, obviously. Okay, so now let's take a look at the destroyer's weaponry systems on our scale. So you can see its weapon points are 14. It's got phasers, 12 of these dual phaser banks, and it's got no mega phasers, and it has 2 torpedoes. So that means its overall defense value is 163,600. And so you can look at some of the other ships here on the graphs, and you can see that this is the lightest that these ships of this generation have. Now, don't let that deceive you. This ship is not defenseless, and it's not even really a weak starship by any means. It's just, compared to the newer generation ships, it just doesn't hold out to their heavy shielding. That is major flaw. But for the most part, this is still a good and decent starship. It can still hold out for quite a while. For a ship of its time period, it's still considered not state-of-the-art, but it's still an advanced destroyer. So now that we have an understanding of what the Genghis class is, we know it's a destroyer. Now let's find out what's going on. So what is going on is these shipping lanes are being attacked by Orion pirates. Now, these Orion pirates, there are 3 major shipping lanes that need to be protected in this area. So Captain Micah is protecting a huge area of sectors. He's got 3 sectors for 1 starship. And the reason for this isn't a high priority area, but it's not exactly a low priority either. But because the Federation has been expanding its borders so quickly, so much, there's just not enough starships to defend everything. And obviously Starfleet is stretched too thin, and they're trying to do the best that they can. What will happen is Captain Micah gets a distress call. He comes in there with the USS Rattlesnake, and then he tries to stop these Orion pirates, and they just keep on evading. And as soon as they come into a sector, and if they see that Micah's ship is there, then they know they just leave and go hit one of the other sectors. So it's this game of cat and mouse that has been going on for months. Now, it's also really important that we understand what Captain Micah is dealing with. So this is a Blockade Runner. It's also known as the Wanderer. So this is probably one of the stronger ships that the Orions have. It consists of 4 disruptors and 4 photon torpedo tubes. Now, some things to take in consideration about this starship is its shielding is pretty minimum, and its hull plating is pretty decent for a ship of its era. But this ship is more of a original Constitution class Captain Kirk era. So this ship is a powerful ship in its time period, but by this time the ship has aged significantly. So that's something to take in consideration. But it does have long-range superiority over the destroyer. Now, this ship isn't by itself, though. It's supported by 2 other ships. So this Orion obviously has the interceptors with it. So Orion interceptors have 1 to 4 particle cannons. And this is an extremely old ship that was seen during the original Enterprise era. So these ships are very old and outdated. None of these ships are capable of taking on a destroyer. Matter of fact, 2 of these interceptors wouldn't even come close to being able to defeat even one Federation destroyer. So these interceptors, they have been modified and upgraded. So they are not the original interceptors from the Enterprise era. They're more of a light destroyer at this point. So these ships will have still probably modified and newer particle cannons, but they don't even have phasers, and their shielding is going to be somewhat minimum. So the Orion captain had a great plan for testing this new destroyer out to see its capabilities. Rather than risk the entire fleet, she decided that she would send the older interceptors to actually engage the destroyer while she sat at torpedo range and just launched her 4 torpedoes at the destroyer. And if they could cripple the ship, that would be great. But if the ship was too dangerous and too powerful and was overwhelming and was able to take out the interceptors extremely quickly, they would know that it would give them enough time to warp out and escape. Now, the plan was to test the destroyer's capabilities, which were unknown at this time. Because you remember, this is a newer generation. This is a Rift generation starship. And the Orions are not familiar with this technology. So when the ships dropped into system, they sent the interceptors first. The interceptors got into disruptor range, and as soon as they started attacking the destroyer, Captain Micah's ship was launching torpedoes at the lead ship. Why that was going on, the lead ship was launching a torpedo barrage from long distance, knowing that if the destroyer is able to take out the interceptors quickly, they would at least have enough time to escape. That is not what happened. As Captain Micah began to push forward through the interceptors, fighting his way through to the command ship, he was then hit with another barrage of torpedoes. At this point, Captain Micah's shields collapsed, and the USS Rattlesnake was in terrible condition. Captain Micah had no choice but to warp out of the system to escape or be destroyed. With Captain Micah's ship in critical condition, they were lucky to make it out alive. The USS Rattlesnake was in absolute terrible condition. So much so that once the USS Rattlesnake made it back to Federation space, it was deemed that the ship was unsalvageable and had to be decommissioned. So after evaluating the situation with the Orions, Admiral Kirk approved that some additional starships can be brought into this situation to stop it from getting out of hand, because these important shipping lanes needed to be protected, and this made the Federation look weak. And the last thing the Federation wanted was another engagement, and so they needed to nip this problem right here and now. So Captain Micah and Admiral Kirk began setting up a plan to deal with the Orions. Now, the first was just to bring a command class cruiser into the mix, and this ship should be more than significant to take out the pirates. But this would also be limiting deep space exploration, which was desperately needed. So Captain Micah came up with a secondary plan, and he brought this plan to Admiral Kirk. So the original plan was to create a small Federation task force consisting of 1 command ship and 2 destroyers. Now, Captain Micah explained that the pirates will never engage any ships that are in the sector. Now that they know that they can destroy a destroyer, they're going to be more emboldened. But they had been avoiding any contact. So we let the captain or the admiral know that most likely if they had a command ship there, there's no way the pirates would ever engage that ship knowing that they probably are going to lose, that they would just avoid it and hit the other systems. But now that they know that they're capable of defeating and destroying one of the new destroyers, they're going to be emboldened to destroy ships that are protected by 1 starship.
But if you don't have one starship there and you have two, then they're not going to engage and they're just going to run away. So Captain Micah came up with a strategy. And this was the strategy that he came up with. Though a destroyer cannot take on one of these ships, he wanted to set them up with a trap. And this trap is he wanted to bring in a fast destroyer. So for those of you who are not familiar with the fast destroyer and you don't know what this class is pretty much identical to a normal destroyer, except for it has two warp nacelles that are percentually close together. So the warp nacelles are extremely close, and the silhouette looks very similar, but there's one big, massive difference. This ship is designed for combat. Now, at first glance, you might think that you're looking at the same identical ship, but you're not. This ship is equipped with two megaphasers. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with megaphasers come with some disadvantages, but some huge advantages. They slow the warp speed of a starship, and they lower the refreshment rate of shields because they are so energy dependent. But they give you a massive increase in offensive capabilities. So a standard Type 7 phase emitter is around 2800. These megaphasers are hitting for over 16,000 terawatts of damage. It is absolutely overwhelming to ships of this time period. But like I said, there are disadvantages to these weapons. They do have a tendency to explode, they are dangerous, and they do lower a lot of the stats of your ship. So these ships, the idea of having these megaphasers on destroyers is that when the destroyers come in, they are hitting incredibly hard. So enemy ships cannot ignore the destroyers, and they have to actually focus their fire on the destroyers rather than the command ships because there's so much firepower coming from these guys. So let's look at the advantages and disadvantages. So we can see that the fast destroyer's got lower shields. It's also got a lower refreshment rate. Now, the reason why those stats are lower, even though it's got two engines, is because this ship is very fast. And it's also dedicating a lot of its power to those megaphasers. So you have a weaker shields, weaker refreshment rate, but you're faster and extremely well armed. This ship is operating at like a heavy destroyer level weaponry. So what does that mean? Well, Captain Micah wanted to do some additional modifications. So the idea is that Captain Micah wanted a ship that could outgun, obviously, the enemy ships, but he wanted something that could catch them if they tried to run. And that's exactly what he got. So Captain Micah did ask for some modifications to his fast destroyer. One of those modifications is the Federation beacon system. This ship's silhouette on radar, on your sensors, will look like a standard destroyer. Now, any ship and any captain, once they get into visual range, they'll take a look at the starship to make sure they're not being tricked. This is a common tactic seen throughout the Klingons, Romulans, and especially the Orions. They're perfectly aware of changing your silhouette of your ship to appear like something else, and they're not going to fall for that. But when they get into sensory range and they see this ship, and then they get into visual range, the similarities are so close that there's a chance the Orions might not know the difference. They might not be able to tell the difference because unless you're up close, really close, you're not going to see those details until it's too late. They look so similar because these ships really are extremely similar. Now, the other thing about the fast destroyer, they were not produced in massive amounts. It's a very unusual starship that is pretty much just around the main key systems because it's combat vessel, so it's defending. So you're not going to see it in deep space very often. So most likely they have never seen this ship. They don't even know it exists. It's not a common ship, and that's another thing that Micah realized. And Captain Micah decided this is what he needed. This is the plan. Captain Micah is going to station his 2 additional starship destroyers in different sectors. Now, what he's going to do is he's going to put the sector that is most valuable, he's going to shut off trade routes to one of those sectors. And then that ship is going to relocate to support the second destroyer. So you will have a section that has no trade going on, a second section that has 2 Federation destroyers there, and then the bait, the fast destroyer, is in the 3rd location. What is going to happen is the Orions are definitely not going to take on 2 Federation destroyers. They're going to go for the 1 destroyer, and they know they can beat a destroyer, so they're going to go in for the kill. So the Orions came in full force, expecting to destroy this destroyer. And of course, they come in there and they start firing at full-time torpedoes. But this fast destroyer comes in and gets into range before it can get overflanked by the interceptors. It uses its mega phasers. And those mega phasers actually punch through the shields of the command ship quickly and efficiently. And after the command ship is disabled, it then starts to focus on the interceptors. Now the interceptors don't hold out very long, and the fast destroyer does take some damage, but overall it disables all 3 ships and tractor beams them back to Federation space, where they're all arrested. So not only did Captain Micah arrest the captain and the crew, but he was able to acquire 3 new starships for the sector defense. And they were outfitted with local members amongst the colonies. And now there were 3 additional starships for patrol. After Admiral Kirk found out about how successful Micah was, and his plan completely went even better than was suspected, there was a surprise for Commander Micah, and that was that the USS Rattlesnake was being recommissioned as an Excelsior-class starship. With the USS Rattlesnake under command of Captain Micah, the sector was protected and well defended. There was no way that the Orions are going to attack an Excelsior-class dreadnought, not to mention it's being supported by a small fleet. Captain Micah went down as one of the best captains in Federation history. Thank you for watching Trek Wars. If you like this material, please subscribe and make a comment. And with that being said, victory is life.